All right, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel, and today I got my meta predictions for the Vancouver Regional Championships, which is, of course, this weekend. We just had EYC, and we did have some pretty interesting results at EYC, which is going to have an impact as to what does good at Vancouver, considering what decks actually did well. We saw some breakthrough performances for some certain archetypes, which will probably make their play rate increase a little bit, but I'm excited here to look at the meta and just talk about things. I will, of course, at the end here be talking about my meta predictions on where the meta share is going to be for each deck on the day one graph and stuff, talk about how popular they're going to be and all that stuff. So yeah, let's get into it. So yeah, Dragapult is, of course, the BDIF. No denying that. It's the best deck. I think the most common way to play Dragapult will still be the Dusknoir build because it's the one that did the best at EYC. A lot of people are still going to be like kind of high on this build of Dragapult. Still probably like the overall most like average decent deck for the Dragapult archetype, but I do think that there will be a little bit more of the Dragapult Budu unfair stamp deck that we saw. I don't think it'll be popular or as popular as the Dusknoir build, but I do think we'll see a little bit more of this archetype as people have probably been testing out this deck and seeing that it's actually pretty solid. So we might see a decent little split. I still expect Dragapult Dusknoir to be overall more popular, but I do think this build still something you got to respect. Honestly, like the farther you go in the tournament, because I expect better, like high tier players are probably going to be on this deck, this list specifically. You expect to hit this build over the Dusknoir build. I think both builds are still very solid, but I think people have been testing this deck for the past couple weeks now, and I think that will translate into more high caliber players playing the Dragapult, Klefki, Unfair Stamp Budu, no Dusknoir deck, or whatever you want to call it, right? That's my take. Gardevoir is still probably the second best deck right now. I think Gardevoir will still be decently popular. Probably not as popular as it was at EYC, but it'll be there. We'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, it's another deck that I could easily see get top 8. Like, Dragapult can win the event. Gardevoir can get top 8. Gardy can win the event. It's a very solid deck. Also, I feel like it's probably a little bit better into the Unfair Stamp Dragapult deck over the Dusknoir build, because you don't have to worry about the Dusknoir pressure as much, which does give the deck a bit more of an easier time. I'm not quite sure how Gardy really pivots for this tournament. One thing with the deck, though, is it is pretty good into Klawf, Terapagos, Budu, which is a pretty good deck for this tournament, and that deck will increase in play rate, in my opinion, after winning EYC. So I do expect Gardy to be, still fairly popular. Like, I think if Klawf didn't win the last, like, if it didn't win EYC, I don't know if Gardy would have been still as popular. But I still expect Gardy to be, like, in the top 3 most played decks. Yeah, let's talk about the Klawf Budu deck. Now, this deck is strong. It did win EYC. It does have weaknesses, though, but it does have a lot of strength. And sometimes the strength are enough to carry the deck forward, right? It has the ability to donk the opponent. It does have a bit of an unfavored matchup, though, into Guardian Dragapult, essentially if they get to play the game. Like, if you don't donk them or you don't run them over quick enough, those two decks usually beat this deck, right? This deck is very powerful, though. It's got a good matchup versus Gholdengo. I assume its Miraidon matchup is favored, because if you have, like, Brute Bonnet, Sneasler in play, it's, like, hard for them to bundle you or whatever. Like, I feel like the deck has good matchups, but it does have its awkward matchups. I don't expect this deck to be, like, overly popular. It did just win an IC, which is exciting. That gets a lot of people to want to play it, but I don't think the deck is going to be as popular as it could have been. Because I think a lot of people realize, oh, this deck isn't very good into Dragapult or Gardevoir if they get to play the game. Donking them is really good, and if you do play this deck to Vancouver, you're probably going to have a couple games against Guardian Dragapult where you just win because you donked them with Peckrunt. It's not going to happen every game, though, and also I don't think that the deck overall can kind of withstand those decks when they get to fully set up. But we'll have to see, though. Also, like, both Guardy and Dragapult playing Unfair Stamp is, like, kind of grief for this deck. This deck is not a big fan of Unfair Stamp, so that's another big issue. So, yeah, definitely feels like this deck will still probably be more popular than it was for EYC, obviously, since it won the tournament, its play rate goes up. I don't think this deck will do the same thing. It's not going to win Vancouver. Maybe it'll make, like, top 16. I don't even know if it'll make top 8, to be honest, because it just didn't feel like enough players are going to be on it. I don't expect any, like, super insane good players are going to be playing this. Like, I don't think they'll be playing Dragapult and Gardevoir, probably. Now, here's what's interesting. Lugia is actually in a pretty good spot. I've been hearing a lot of murmurings about Lugia having a big tournament at Vancouver. It's also, keep in mind, Lugia's last major, huge tournament before it rotates. This is, like, for a lot of players, the last time to ever play Lugia VSTAR again, because we don't think we're going to expand a tournament. So if you want to play Lugia, Vancouver could be the tournament to play it. And to be honest, it's not in a bad spot. I mean, Dragapult and Gardy are both matchups that, you probably can beat if you set up. You beat Klawf Budu pretty easily, I feel like. Really, the difference makers, like, are you going to respect both Dengo, Miraidon, and Archaludon? Those are, like, your 3 big ops for Lugia, but If Lugia's playing the double Cinccino, those matchups become easier. I've also been seeing a lot of Radzard in Lugia recently, which is a bit better into Gholdengo because you can Radzard knock out the Gholdengo with a one-prizer. So that also could be good. So I do think Lugia will have a good weekend. Top 8 is definitely on the table. I mean, again, it's Lugia's last tournament in the standard format, basically. Like, it's a big last hurrah for Lugia. Lugia dominated the game. It dominated Vancouver, 2 years ago in 2023. So a lot of players probably want to play it one last time. It's also not in a bad spot for the tournament, theoretically speaking. Because also, I do think Miraidon's play rate does drop a little bit. So I'm going to say there's going to be a Lugia in top 8. Now, speaking of Miraidon definitely has gone down a little bit, I feel like, in the rankings. It's still a decent archetype, and it's still strong. It's still scary, but it's just not as good as it was post-Merida, or even for Merida, for that matter, As lists are starting to evolve, it gets worse. That unfair stamp Dragapult with Blood Moon Ursaluna build that everyone might be on is not a great matchup for this deck overall for the Dragapults. You'd rather play against Dragapult Duster, in my opinion. But Miraidon is still a strong archetype. It's still hard to beat sometimes when it sets up. It's still very much a checkmate deck where it's like, hey, I amped you turn 1. Can you deal with it? No? Okay, I win. Like, that's basically how it is. Also, like I said, Guardy will still be fairly popular. That's still a good matchup for Miraidon. The Klawf deck is probably like your worst matchup in the room because it's tough to beat them with how they kind of run you over or how they can use Klawf against you. Gholdengo and Archaludon aren't great matchups either, but you can still beat them. Like Zapdos helps against the Archaludon, and then Gholdengo you can beat if you usually like kind of prize map if they don't set up quick enough. But yeah, Miraidon's still a great archetype. I don't think it'll be like as good for this tournament. Like it's still not overall the best play, but it definitely is sneakily a bit of a better play. Also, keep in mind if Lugia is more well positioned for this tournament, there's a reason to stay on Miraidon, I feel like. So it's definitely in a weird spot where I feel like it wasn't as good for EYC, but post EYC, this deck feels a little bit better, especially if Lugia does have a resurgence. We'll see on that one, though. Gholdengo is next. This was like one of the big breakout decks of EYC. Nobody would have expected Gholdengo to do so well, but Gholdengo did well. One of the things that makes it good is it has a great matchup into Dragapult, pretty good Guardy matchup, and then Archaludon, Miraidon, pretty good too. It's got a lot of good matchups. The problem with the deck is, one, I feel like now everyone knows about the deck. It kind of cat's out of the bag. Also, that Klawf Budu matchup is atrocious. It is easily Gholdengo's worst matchup, apart from Snorlax with an Ogre Pawn, Cornerstone Ogre Pawn. So I don't know how good Gholdengo is for this tournament. I do think it's slightly worse than it was for EYC. For EYC, I think it was 100% like the play. For Vancouver, it's like probably fine. It's probably in the same position Miraidon was after Merida, in my opinion. Like, it's in that same realm of, like, it's good, just not going to be as good as it was for that tournament. I think it'll actually still be fairly popular. It's a fun deck to play, right? It's Gholdengo. All right, next up is Archaludon, which is also still pretty good. It's like fine. Actually, I don't think it's that good. It's okay. I think Dialga's I think you have to play Dialga if you're gonna play Archaludon this weekend, in my opinion. Archaludon does have some cool things it can do versus like Miraidon. I think the Klawf Budu matchup's fairly favored in my opinion. I think other than that, like you're okay. Dragapult's okay. Guardy's not great. Gholdengo's atrocious for you. It's like very polarizing deck, but it's still good. And sometimes Dialga can make the deck stronger than it usually should be instead of just playing like just straight Archaludon, right? Could it make top 8 again? It's possible. It did make top 4 at EYC. It's possible it can run it back. I do want to mention Lost Box real quick. This is another sneaky good play for EYC that unfortunately I don't think is as favored for Vancouver. One of the issues this deck does face is now that Dragapult is playing Unfair Stamp. That's a big issue. That's not fun. Gardevoir playing Unfair Stamp. Guardy potentially playing Klefki, Fluttermane, Budu, whatever. Also, your matchup against Budu is also pretty bad in my opinion because Budu can knock out your Comfies with Poison, which is pretty atrocious. Yes, you can Cramorant them. You have Jet Energy and stuff. Like, you can try to manipulate around the Budu, but, like, I feel like that Klawf Budu matchup is just not good for this deck whatsoever, which is why I don't think Lost Box is as favored for Vancouver anymore. It's still not terrible. I don't expect it to be very popular. I know it's, like, one of Lost Box's last times to be in the format, so there's another kind of Lugia situation where people are going to play it before it rotates, but still, I feel like it's less favored for this tournament than it was for UIC. That's just my opinion, though. Especially if this Dragapult Stamp deck catches on. It's not good for this deck. Because you go like Ninja turn 2, they just go Unfair Stamp you to 2, and you don't find a Colress. I don't know. It doesn't feel very good. All right. Pulsar, a lot of people like this deck. I mean, the deck's fine. I don't think it's the best way to play Dragapult, but it's like a decent little deck. Nothing too crazy there. I think it'll still have some decent results. Top 32, maybe a top 16. We did see it in asymmetrical cut at UIC, so it was able to go fairly far. Snorlax is weird. I actually don't know if Snorlax is good for this tournament. It's like not terrible if you hit a lot of players who don't know how to play against it, but keep in mind Vancouver is a smaller regional, so the density is like going to be a lot higher of good players, right? You know what I mean? So it's like that alone scares me from wanting to play Snorlax. The other thing with Snorlax is I actually don't think it beats Dragapult when they have Turo, Dusknoir. Like the strategy usually is like Dragapult will pop all the Dusknoirs and the Liono counter catcher kill the Rotom and just be like, deal with it. And they have the Turos in the deck still to like kind of play around any shenanigans you try to do. Like it's just, I don't think Snorlax beats Dragapult if they know what they're doing. Like it's a fine deck. It's just, I don't know, man. Like if you're gonna beat, if you want to do well at Vancouver, I don't know if Snorlax is a great play. Drago, on the other hand, is interesting. So this deck had a couple good placements in EUIC, which is crazy to think about considering how far this deck has fallen from its grace. Now, I don't think that's going to translate to the deck actually being popular, but I mean, it's just another one of those like really powerful archetypes that if Drago does its thing, it's doing really good. It's just never going to do as good as it was before. Top 16 for Drago, run it back. Yeah, I guess. Gouging Fire also, could do decent this weekend. It's another one of those decks that like people like to play. It's another big basic deck. It's still worse than Miraidon in my opinion, but it's like okay. It does have a better Gholdengo matchup than Miraidon though, which I will give it that. So and a better Archaludon matchup for that matter. Control, weird deck. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if like a weird control pile did well at Vancouver. The meta's still kind of wide, but seeing some of the decks do well recently might, give people more ideas to how to deck build for the control. I wouldn't be surprised if a control pile did okay, like a top 32 at most. Another like interesting thing is Charizard itself. So Pulsar is still probably going to be the more popular version of Charizard. If my opponent flips over a Charmander, I'm expecting them to have a Dreepy on their bench also. But Charizard Pidgeot, it's like I just don't. The deck's not good right now, but people played at UIC. It did have some okay results. Like it didn't like completely bomb UIC like I thought it might have, but it. I don't think Charizard I don't think you have to worry about like Charizard Pidgeot for Vancouver. It's just not going to exist. Maybe one in top 64. Pull Thorns. I actually think this deck is kind of underrated right now. It's not as strong as the other Dragapult decks, but it does have the advantage of playing Iron Thorns and kind of leans into the Klefki. So like the deck's cool. You can also put the Toadscroll back in, right? If you want to beat Gholdengo a little bit more consistently. So I actually don't think this deck is actually in a bad spot right now. It's kind of a weird like under the radar deck for the tournament. My one issue with this deck though is I don't think it's very good against Gholdengo. I don't think it's very good against Gardevoir, and I don't think it's. I think it's just Gardevoir, right? That's probably the and Archaludon. Archaludon and Gardevoir seem like pretty bad matchups for this deck. Gardevoir specifically, I can't figure out if this deck actually beats that deck. But like I said, I don't think Pull Thorns is in a bad spot right now. Surprisingly, it seems okay because you can tech it for the meta. Also, again, starting Thorns is like really good against decks like Klawf and Miraidon where they can't play the game. And then Ceruledge, another deck that I don't really expect to be popular, but somebody will probably like have somewhat of an okay run with it. It's like top 32able, top 64able. It's not a terrible deck. And then Raging Bolt. I like this deck. Like, it beats Dragapult really well, which is what I like about it. Though, I guess with that Unfair Stamp build, it's not as good anymore. Yeah, if the Unfair Stamp Dragapult deck's popular, it's probably not going to be the way to go. If everyone was still playing Dusknoir, Raging Bolt's still pretty good. But yeah, if people are playing the Unfair Stamp build, I don't know about that. Raging Bolt, definitely, it's probably not the right time to play it. It's like, okay, if you just literally hit 9 Dragapults in day 1, make day 2. There you go, boom, problem solved. I do want to have one quick shout out to Hydreigon. There was a Hydreigon in day 2 at UIC. I don't know if anyone's going to play Hydreigon in this tournament. Probably not. Again, smaller tournament. But yo, if somebody wants to play Hydreigon in this tournament, I want to see it in day 2. It's cool. So that's going to be my wild card pick. The pick for what wins the tournament, I'm going to give it to like Lugia, Dragapult, or Gardevoir. One of those 3 decks. Those, to me, feel like the 3 decks that can win the tournament. I don't think we'll see a Klawf Badu in top 8. We might see a Gholdengo in top 8. Miraidon might make top 8 too, because I do think there might be more Lugia. But anyways, now let's get into the meta percentage part of the video. Let me just make this a bit easier for you to see. So, meta prediction time. Dragapult itself. So, let's see here. Dragapult. So, Dragapult is probably going to be, in my opinion, 18% of the meta. Like, yeah, very good chance it's 18% of the meta. It's Dragapult, right? Everyone, I think a lot of top players are playing it this weekend. It's going to be popular. It's going to be the most played deck in the room. I think 18% is pretty fair. This is also probably just combining the 2 variants of like Pulsar and stuff and all the other like builds. Guardy will probably be around, I can see 9% Gardevoir. Guardy 9% seems okay. 10% maybe. I don't know if I can't really put Guardy that high. 9% feels a little bit more fair for Gardevoir. Gholdengo will probably be at like a 6 to 7-ish percent. 7 might actually be a little bit more kinder. Yeah, actually, yeah, 7% for Gholdengo actually seems a bit more reasonable. I don't think it'll be as popular as it could have been. Like, I don't know. 7% I think is fine. Like, I don't see it being any higher than like 7%, 6, 7% in that range. Miraidon will probably be 8%. People are still very much high on this deck. I think that also, it's not a bad time to play it. If you are somebody who's predicting Lugia to make a rebound, it's not a bad time to play Miraidon. 8% I feel like is fair for Miraidon. Raging Bolt, I'll 4%, 3%. Probably a 3%er. People will play Raging Bolt because it's Raging Bolt. I don't think the deck is great, but 3%. I can see Lugia being like a 7%er like Gholdengo. Probably in that same range. Probably 7 to 8%, not 6 to 7 like Gholdengo would be. I could definitely see Lugia being in that like 7, 8% range. For sure. Yeah, Klawf also another 7%er. Like, I feel like Lugia, Klawf, and Gholdengo are in that like 7% range of like people are gonna play them. They're just not going to be as popular as they really could have been. I still think like Guardian Miraidon are still going to outclass them in popularity, but 7% for all these decks seem correct. Klawf, Badu might be more of a 6% deck than a 7% deck. I'd probably put it more on the low side because I feel like Lugia and Gholdengo are just better placed in this deck overall, but people are still going to play it because they just want an icy. Archaludon is probably going to be in that 8 to 7% range too. 89% Archaludon's crazy. It'll probably be in that 8% range, like Miraidon, most likely. I mean, they're kind of similar decks. There's big basics kind of do their thing. Well, Archaludon's not a basic deck. You get my point, though. Like, they're kind of just the same style of deck. Yeah, 8% for Archaludon. People want to let the deck die. 8% seems correct. Sarah Ledge, I mean, yeah, this is going to be like a 2% deck. Dragapult, I guess if we're counting, I'm just going to combine the two together, right? Lost Box will probably be 3%. I think the deck is still like not terrible, but again, it feels like it's a bit worse for this tournament. I guess if like there is a little bit more Lugia that's better for the deck, but again, if like Guardy, Dragapult are playing Unfair Stamp, that's not ideal for the deck. Also, I don't think Miraidon has never been like a great matchup. That's still going to be popular, right? Charizard, low-key 4% for Charizard. I mean, I'm not going to combine it with Pulsar, but 4% for Charizard does seem kind of reasonable for that. Snorlax will probably be like another 3%, 4% deck. Even though, like I said, I don't think it actually beats Dragapult that well, but people will play it just to play it, right? Regidrago, 4%. I don't think Drago's like the best deck ever, but again, it did have some good runs in UIC. That might inspire people to try it out. We have 82% of the meta left. Honestly, we probably... Okay, Dragapult won't overlap the meta that much. Okay, we'll bump Gardevoir up to a 10%. We'll bump Miraidon up to 9%. Maybe we'll bump up Archaludon to 9%. And then, like, everything else, but everything else does feel correct, though. Like, would Other really be the rest? Honestly, Other could just be the rest of the meta for sure. I think, in my opinion, this is probably what we're going to see the meta at Vancouver look like for the day one graph. But who knows? Anything is possible. But I hope you all enjoyed today's video here on Second Channel. Let me know what your predictions are for Vancouver. Let me know in the comment section below. If you see me this weekend, don't be afraid to come up and say hi and all that stuff. Love meeting people. Love meeting subscribers and stuff. So definitely don't be afraid to interact with me. And I'll catch y'all later. Bye-bye.